Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt journeys of resilience, love, and personal growth. Today's story takes us into the life of Lily, a young woman who faced unimaginable challenges in her own home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. From enduring unfair treatment to standing up for herself and reclaiming her peace. Lily's journey is one of strength, self-discovery, and the power of letting go. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we explore Lily's path to finding her voice and building a future that's truly her own. Let's dive into today's story. For as long as I can remember, it was just Dad and me. Mom passed away when I was barely 4, leaving behind an emptiness that neither of us knew how to fill. Our house, this big, old house nestled on a quiet street in Denver, was more than just a home. It had a soul, a history. It belonged to my grandparents, my mom's parents, and every corner seemed to hold whispers of memories I was too young to recall. Dad did his best to keep things steady. He threw himself into work, perhaps as a way to distract himself from the grief that weighed on us both. For years, he didn't date. In fact, he didn't even seem interested in it. When I was around 12, I began noticing little changes. He would go out for the occasional coffee or dinner with someone, but they were fleeting connections. None of them came to the house, and he never seemed particularly excited about any of them. To me, it felt like he was simply going through the motions, trying to piece together a life that had shattered so long ago. That all changed when I turned 14. By then, both of my grandparents had passed away, and it was just Dad and me. Two solitary figures in this large, creaking house. One evening, I noticed something different about him as he walked through the front door. He seemed nervous, almost as if he were about to deliver news that might change everything. "Lily," he began, clearing his throat and setting down his briefcase. "I want you to meet someone special." The tone in his voice stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't casual or light-hearted, it was serious. Intentional. A tall, elegant woman stepped into the house behind him, her blonde hair impeccably styled and her nails looking like they had just come from a salon. "This is Stephanie," he said, gesturing toward her with a nervous smile. Stephanie smiled warmly, but my eyes were drawn to the two figures standing behind her. "These are my kids," she said, her voice as polished as her appearance. "This is Ryan, he's in his first year of college. And this is Madison, she's 16. Ryan barely looked up from his phone, mumbling a half-hearted hey while Madison's gaze locked onto mine. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a silent warning I couldn't quite place. Later that evening, while I was putting away dishes in the kitchen, Madison cornered me. "Just because our parents are dating," she said, crossing her arms, "doesn't mean we have to be friends. Let's keep our distance." "Okay." I nodded, too stunned to argue. Things moved fast after that. Within 6 months, Dad and Stephanie were married. Suddenly, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. Ryan took over the guest room, and the study was converted into a bedroom for Madison. Stephanie's belongings seemed to multiply overnight, filling every shelf, every cabinet, and even the bathroom. Either Stephanie was in there for hours, meticulously going through her beauty routine, or Madison was hogging it for endless selfie sessions. I started waking up an hour earlier just to shower before school. Despite all of this, I didn't complain. Not when I saw the way Dad's face lit up whenever Stephanie walked into the room. He started humming while making breakfast, something I hadn't heard since Mom died. He came home early to have dinner with us, his eyes sparkling in a way that made me almost believe he'd found happiness again. And that was enough for me. At least, for a while. But things began to shift again when Dad got his big promotion. He came home one night, his tie loosened and a grin spread wide across his face. "Regional Sales Director," he announced during dinner, his voice brimming with pride. Stephanie clapped her hands together, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, David, that's amazing," she exclaimed. "We'll need to celebrate properly. And of course, this means some upgrades." The kitchen could use a full renovation. And maybe we should look into a new car. Her words barely registered with me. All I could focus on was the phrase Dad had mentioned earlier, extensive travel. It turned out extensive meant weeks at a time. Sometimes even a full month. The first time he left on a business trip. The atmosphere in the house changed overnight. The second his car pulled out of the driveway, Stephanie turned to me with a look I'd never seen before. It was cold. Calculating. "Lily," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "We need to set some ground rules while your father's away." Those ground rules quickly turned into an unrelenting list of chores and restrictions. I had to be home by 4:30 p.m. sharp, no exceptions. Study groups. Volleyball practice. Forget it. "But I have practice on Thursdays," I protested one evening. "Then you'll have to quit," Stephanie replied, her tone devoid of empathy. "Someone needs to help with dinner and housework." For the first few days, I rushed home from school, barely catching my breath before Stephanie started barking orders. "The floors need mopping. Lily. These windows are filthy. Chop the vegetables for dinner." Meanwhile, Madison sprawled on the couch, phone in hand, giggling at whatever her latest boyfriend texted. Ryan was rarely home, and when he was, he left his dirty dishes in the sink and his laundry in a pile, expecting someone else to deal with it. I didn't say anything. Not when I saw how happy Dad seemed during his brief returns home. Not when Stephanie sighed dramatically at the dinner table, painting herself as the exhausted, selfless matriarch of the household. Not when Dad kissed her forehead and told her how amazing she was. I kept quiet, swallowing my frustration. Because as long as Dad was happy, wasn't that what mattered most? But deep down, I was beginning to realize that silence came with a cost. It was during one of Dad's longer business trips that things finally came to a head. The days felt endless, filled with Stephanie's orders and Madison's casual indifference. I didn't complain out loud, but inside, the frustration was building. It wasn't just the chores or the strict rules, it was the unfairness of it all. I was constantly cleaning, cooking, and picking up after everyone, while Madison lounged around, taking selfies, and Ryan stayed conveniently absent. One evening, as I scrubbed pots at the sink and Madison blasted TikTok videos at full volume from the couch, something inside me snapped. I turned, water dripping from my hands, and called out, "Why doesn't Madison help with any of this?" Stephanie, who had been lounging at the kitchen table with a magazine, slowly set it down and fixed me with a glare that could cut glass. "Madison needs to focus on her college applications," she said coolly. "She doesn't have time to waste on housework." I looked over at Madison, who was filming herself doing some ridiculous dance. "Really? She looks real busy," I muttered under my breath. Stephanie's voice sharpened. "Lily, I won't tolerate disrespect in this house." Her words stung, but I bit my tongue. What was the point of arguing? Dad wasn't here to see how things really were. He wasn't here to witness how the woman he trusted had turned his daughter into the household servant. And that was the worst part. Stephanie wasn't just harsh, she was a master manipulator. The moment Dad returned, she transformed. She'd sigh dramatically, slump into her chair, and lament how hard things had been while he was away. "Oh, David, you have no idea how much work it is to manage everything on my own," she'd say, her voice dripping with faux exhaustion. "The house, the kids. It's exhausting." Dad, oblivious and eager to make her happy, would pull out some expensive gift he'd picked up during his trip, a designer handbag, a perfume bottle, jewelry, and present it to her with a proud smile. "You're amazing," he'd say, kissing her forehead. "I don't know how you do it all." I'd stand there, my hands raw from cleaning, my homework waiting to be done, and watch this performance unfold. Stephanie would give me a triumphant smile, as if to say, "See, he believes me, not you." Madison wasn't any better. She seemed to enjoy my misery. smirking at me from behind her phone whenever Stephanie put me in my place. But the breaking point came one Tuesday evening. We were all gathered around the dinner table, me, Stephanie, Ryan, and Madison. Dad had been gone for over 2 weeks, and I was beginning to feel the strain of juggling school, chores, and Stephanie's incessant demands. Stephanie cleared her throat and smiled at me, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Lily," she began, her voice syrupy sweet. "We need to have a serious conversation." I tensed, unsure of where this was going. "Okay. Now that you're 18, she continued, her tone carefully measured. "You're legally an adult. And adults have responsibilities. Starting next month, you'll need to pay rent. $500 a month seems fair." I literally choked on my food. Ryan thumped me on the back, laughing as I sputtered, "What? I'm still in high school." Stephanie shrugged, completely unfazed. "Doesn't matter. You're an adult now. And we can't afford to support freeloaders." I glanced around the table. Ryan and Madison were smirking, clearly enjoying the spectacle. My mind raced as I tried to process her words. "What happens if I can't pay?" I asked, my voice shaky. Stephanie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, her tone turning icy, "then you'll need to find somewhere else to live." Something inside me snapped. I set my fork down and looked her directly in the eye. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. Ryan, who graduated 2 years ago and spends all day playing video games, doesn't pay rent. Madison, who hasn't lifted a finger in years, doesn't pay rent. But I have to. Stephanie dabbed her mouth with a napkin, her expression smug. "My children don't need to pay rent while they're getting established." A strange calm settled over me. "Well, that's interesting," I said, leaning back in my chair, "because I won't be paying rent either." Her face twitched. "Oh, you will," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my house, Lily. My rules." I smiled, a real smile, not the polite, keep the peace one I'd worn for years. "Actually, Stephanie," I said quietly, "it's not your house. It's mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie blinked at me, her expression frozen in a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out at first. Finally, she let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "What nonsense are you talking about, Lily?" she asked, waving her hand dismissively. "This house belongs to your father, which means it's my house now." I didn't flinch. "No, it doesn't," I said, my voice steady and calm. "This house was put in my name before my grandparents passed away. They left it to me." The laughter died on her lips. Her face went pale, and the smugness that had defined her demeanor just moments ago vanished. Ryan and Madison, who had been snickering earlier, now exchanged uneasy glances. "That's ridiculous," Stephanie snapped, grabbing her phone. Her fingers trembled as she began dialing. "I'm calling your father right now. We'll settle this nonsense." The room fell silent as the dial tone echoed, and I crossed my arms, waiting. When Dad finally answered, Stephanie's tone changed instantly. Gone was the commanding queen of the house, in her place was the sweet, suffering wife. "David, darling," she began, her voice tight but controlled. "We've got a bit of a situation here. Lily is saying some rather interesting things about the house. She claims it belongs to her. That's not true, right?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Dad shifting uncomfortably, and then he cleared his throat. "Well, actually, it is true." Stephanie's eyes widened in shock. "Excuse me? The house was put in Lily's name before my in-laws passed away," Dad explained, his voice quieter now. "I didn't think it was important to mention." "Not important," Stephanie shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made Madison wince. "David, how could you not tell me your daughter owns this house? You let me move in here, thinking it was ours. Dad's voice grew defensive. It never seemed relevant. Stephanie. It's still our home. But Stephanie wasn't having it. Her anger boiled over, and she slammed the phone down on the table with enough force to make the plates rattle. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. This changes nothing, she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. You're still under this roof, Lily, and you'll still follow my rules. Do you understand? No, I said simply. She stared at me, dumbfounded. What did you just say? I said no. I repeated, standing up from the table. I'm done following your rules. This is my house. And if you don't like it, you're free to leave. Stephanie's face turned a deep shade of red. For a moment, she looked like she might explode. But instead, she forced a high-pitched laugh. This has all been a big misunderstanding, she said, smoothing her hair. Of course. You don't need to pay rent. Lily. Let's just forget this whole conversation ever happened. Shall we? I didn't respond. I wasn't stupid enough to believe she would give up that easily. Instead, I turned and left the kitchen, heading upstairs to my room. The next morning, I woke up early, unable to shake the tension from the night before. As I descended the stairs, I heard Stephanie's voice, low and urgent. She was on the phone, and curiosity got the better of me. I sat quietly on the stairs, listening. David, you need to do something about this situation, she hissed. Your daughter can't just stay here. She's making things difficult. There was a pause, and then Dad's voice, hesitant but clear, replied. Stephanie, it's her house. We can't just kick her out. Nobody's talking about kicking her out, Stephanie said, her tone syrupy again. But maybe we should guide her in the right direction. What about the colleges she applied to? Encourage her to pick one out of state. Tell her it'll be good for her independence. My stomach clenched as Dad replied. Maybe you're right. I'll talk to her. I sat there, frozen. They were planning to get rid of me. Later that day, Stephanie acted as though nothing had happened. She smiled sweetly, chirping good morning as she sipped her coffee. Ryan and Madison shuffled into the kitchen, barely acknowledging me. But I couldn't keep quiet anymore. By the way, I said, setting my mug down on the table. Starting next month, you'll all need to start paying rent. $500 per person seems fair. You know, since we're all adults here. Stephanie froze, her piece of toast halfway to her mouth. Ryan dropped his phone into his cereal, and Madison's spoon clattered against her plate. Excuse me? Stephanie whispered, her voice a dangerous edge of disbelief. I smiled calmly. Rent. I repeated. It's time you all learned about financial responsibility. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Stephanie's expression shifted from disbelief to barely contained fury. Her carefully composed demeanor cracked. And for the first time since she moved into the house, she looked completely caught off guard. You can't be serious, she finally managed, her voice trembling as she set her coffee cup down with a sharp clink. Oh, I'm very serious, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Since you're all so keen on the idea of paying rent, I think $500 per person is more than fair. After all, we're adults now, aren't we? Stephanie's face turned an alarming shade of red. But we're family, she sputtered, her voice rising. Family doesn't charge family rent. That's not how things work. I raised an eyebrow. Funny, I replied, keeping my tone deliberately light. You said the exact opposite last night when you tried to charge me rent. Ryan, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, abruptly pushed his chair back and stood up, knocking it over in the process. Listen here, he began, his tone laced with anger. No, you listen. I cut him off, my voice sharp and unwavering. You've been out of college for 2 years. Ryan, you don't have a job. And you spend all day playing video games while I've been paying for groceries with my part-time job. Maybe it's time you learned about financial responsibility. Ryan glared at me, his jaw tightening. But he didn't argue. He sat back down, his face flushed with embarrassment. I turned to Madison next. And you? I said, narrowing my eyes. When was the last time you even did your own laundry? Or cleaned up after yourself? You think you can just lounge around while everyone else does the work? Madison opened her mouth to respond. But Stephanie cut her off. This is revenge, she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. You're just a spiteful little girl. Jealous of my children. I leaned forward, meeting her glare head-on. No, Stephanie, I said, my voice low but steady. This is me standing up for myself. Something I should have done a long time ago. Stephanie stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor as she pushed it back. She crossed her arms and glared down at me, her fury palpable. You'll regret this, she hissed. You have no idea what you're doing. Maybe, I said, standing to face her. Or maybe I'm finally doing the right thing. Stephanie stormed out of the kitchen, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. Ryan and Madison exchanged uneasy glances before following her, leaving me alone at the table. The next hour was a blur of slamming doors, hurried footsteps, and raised voices as they packed their belongings. I stayed in the kitchen, listening as Stephanie barked orders at Ryan and Madison to hurry up. Finally, they were gone. Stephanie didn't even bother closing the front door as she stormed out to her car, her children trailing behind her like scolded puppies. The house felt oddly quiet once they left. I wandered from room to room, taking in the mess they had left behind. Madison's room, formerly the study, was littered with makeup, clothes, and empty snack wrappers. Ryan's room wasn't much better, with soda cans and piles of dirty laundry scattered across the floor. It took me hours to clean up after them. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the house. For the first time in years, it felt peaceful. The next day, the phone rang in the afternoon. Dad's name flashed on the screen, and I took a deep breath before answering. What the hell do you think you're doing? He exploded as soon as I said hello. His voice was loud and angry, so much so that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Hi, Dad, I said calmly. How's the trip going? Don't hi, Dad me, he snapped. Stephanie just called me in hysterics. She said you kicked them out. How could you be so cruel? Something inside me broke. Cruel? I repeated, my voice sharp. Interesting choice of words. Where was this concern about cruelty when Stephanie tried to charge me rent for living in my own house? The line went silent for a moment. When Dad finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost uncertain. Stephanie never. Don't lie to me, I interrupted, my voice shaking with anger. I heard you on the phone with her. She told you to encourage me to move out. And you agreed. After everything I've done for this family, you chose her over me. Lily. Honey. You don't understand. Oh. I understand perfectly, I said, cutting him off again. Stephanie wanted me gone, and you were willing to let her have her way. I'm done. Dad. I'm done being treated like I don't matter. The line went dead. He had hung up on me. After Dad hung up, I sat on the couch, staring at my phone. My hands trembled, not from fear but from an overwhelming mix of anger and sadness. The man who had once been my protector, my rock, had chosen someone else's happiness over mine. For years, I had told myself it didn't matter, that as long as he was happy, I could endure anything. But now, the weight of his betrayal pressed on me like never before. Graduation day came and went without a word from him. The ceremony was beautiful, but the empty seats in the family section felt like a cold reminder of everything I had lost. My best friend, Sarah, and her parents were there, though. They hugged me tight, took pictures, and even invited me to their celebration dinner. They didn't mention the absence of my family, but their hugs lingered longer than usual, and I was grateful for it. In the days that followed, I threw myself into preparing for my next chapter. I had been accepted to several universities, but one stood out to me, Northwestern University, nearly 1,000 miles away in Illinois. Something about the distance felt right, like a necessary step to leave the chaos behind and rebuild my life. While packing my things, I kept reminding myself that this was a fresh start. Still, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness as I boxed up my childhood memories. Among the clutter, I found a photo from when I was little, me and Dad on the front porch. His arms lifting me up so I could reach the doorbell. His smile in the picture was warm and genuine, the kind that reached his eyes. I didn't recognize that man anymore. A week before I was set to leave for college, Dad's car pulled into the driveway. I watched from my bedroom window as he stepped out, accompanied by Stephanie, Ryan, and Madison. They were dressed like they were heading to a business meeting, their faces cold and distant. I met them at the front door before they could knock. "Lily," Dad said, his tone carefully controlled. "We've come to resolve this situation." I leaned against the doorframe, waiting. "I'm willing to forgive your recent behavior," he continued, ignoring the smug smile that spread across Stephanie's face. "We can all move back in, and things can go back to normal. But you need to apologize to Stephanie and her kids and, of course, drop this ridiculous idea about rent." I stared at him, trying to reconcile this man with the father I once knew. His words, rehearsed and devoid of genuine emotion, cut deeper than I expected. "No," I said simply. His expression cracked for the briefest moment. "What do you mean?" "No. I mean no," I repeated, standing straighter. "I'm done being the doormat. I'm done pretending this is okay." His jaw tightened, and Stephanie stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Lily, sweetheart, don't be so rash. This is your family." "No," I said firmly, meeting her gaze. "You're not my family. You've never treated me like family." Dad's face hardened. "If you can't be part of this family," he said coldly, "then I'm done. I'm leaving. And I'm disowning you. Is that what you want?" A strange calm washed over me. "That's your choice, Dad," I said quietly. "You've been choosing Stephanie and her kids over me for years. Why stop now?" Stephanie gasped dramatically, clutching her chest like a bad actress in a soap opera. "How dare you," she hissed. "You've always been jealous of my children, always trying to come between us." I pulled out my phone and held it up. "One more word, and I'm calling the police for harassment," I said evenly. "Your choice." Her mouth snapped shut. Dad packed the few belongings he had left in the house in silence. None of them said goodbye. They simply loaded into Stephanie's car and drove away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the driveway. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just empty, it was peaceful, like a storm had finally passed. The next morning, I finalized my arrangements with a local property management agency. They found tenants for the house, a young family with 2 little girls. As I handed over the keys, I felt an odd sense of closure. This house had held so much pain and turmoil, but now it would be filled with laughter and joy again. When I arrived at Northwestern a week later, it felt like stepping into a new life. The distance from home gave me room to breathe, to focus on myself without the weight of the past dragging me down. Starting college at Northwestern was like stepping into a world I'd only ever dreamed of, a world where I could finally be myself, free from the burdens of my old life. The campus buzzed with energy, and the people I met seemed genuinely interested in who I was, not what I could do for them. It was liberating. And for the first time in years, I began to feel like my own person. The house I had left behind no longer loomed over me like a shadow. Knowing it was being cared for by a young family brought me comfort. I liked imagining the sound of children's laughter echoing through its halls, replacing the tension and silence that had marked so many of my years there. The rental income was more than enough to cover my college expenses, so I could focus entirely on my studies. But even with this fresh start, there were nights when memories of my dad and the life we once shared crept in. I would scroll through old photos on my phone, pausing on one in particular, the picture of us on the porch, with his arms holding me up so I could ring the doorbell. His smile in that photo was genuine, filled with love and pride. I couldn't help but wonder if he missed me, if he regretted the choices he had made. But those thoughts were fleeting. I had learned not to dwell on what I couldn't change. Over the months, I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I threw myself into my classes, joined study groups, and even found a part-time job at the campus library. The structure and routine gave me a sense of purpose. Slowly, I started to believe in my own strength, the kind that had always been there but had been buried under years of sacrifice and silence. Then, one afternoon, I received a call from Sarah, my best friend back home. "You'll never believe this," she began, her tone half amused, half incredulous. "Your dad and Stephanie had to take out a massive loan to pay for Madison's college tuition. Apparently, the interest rates are through the roof." I didn't feel the pang of guilt I might have once felt. Instead, I simply nodded and said, "I guess they'll figure it out." For so long, I had carried the weight of their decisions on my shoulders, constantly trying to keep the peace. But now, I realized that wasn't my burden to bear. As the months turned into a year, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. I no longer worried about pleasing everyone around me. I stopped measuring my worth against their approval. Instead, I focused on the people who truly cared for me, friends who celebrated my achievements and lifted me up when I stumbled. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. I also stopped waiting for my dad to reach out. He hadn't called since that final argument. And while it hurt at first, I came to accept it. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had spent too much of my life waiting for people to see my worth. Now, I knew that my value didn't depend on their recognition. One day, as I walked back to my dorm after class, I stopped at a cafe to grab a coffee. The barista handed me my drink with a warm smile, and as I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filled my lungs. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I was exactly where I needed to be. The past had shaped me, yes, but it didn't define me. I had learned to stand up for myself, to fight for the life I deserved. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain: I was stronger than I had ever imagined. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the little girl I once was, standing on the porch with her dad, full of hope and wonder. I wasn't that little girl anymore, but in a way, I was still carrying her with me, only now I was the one holding her up. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was mine, and that was enough. And so, life moved on, as it always does. The journey to finding myself wasn't easy, but it taught me the most valuable lesson: sometimes, you have to let go of the people who don't see your worth to make space for those who do. My past will always be a part of me, but it no longer controls me. I've built a life filled with genuine love, respect, and peace, a life that is truly my own. As I sip my coffee and watch the world go by, I know I'm ready for whatever comes next. Because this time, I'm walking forward with confidence, knowing I am enough, just as I am. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want more inspiring tales of life and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the Life Stories channel for our latest videos.